next speaker is going to be Dr. Ciaran Casey. And to introduce him and to chair the session, we have Felix Larkin, an eminent historian of the press, former public servant in very high-level places like the Department of Finance and the NTMA, a Mandarin, in other words, an actual real-live Mandarin is going to be here on the stage. And he is going to introduce Ciaran, who is going to bring us into the heart of one of the serious questions about records that are not transferred to the National Archives and what condition they're in. Felix, if you wouldn't mind taking over here. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina, and congratulations on the organisation of this conference. We all had some involvement in it on the committee, but it really was Katrina's baby, and she made it happen. So congratulations to her for that. My task this morning is the very pleasant one of introducing Dr. Ciaran Casey. He's an economic historian now teaching in the University of Limerick. Educated at UCD and Oxford University, he is the author of the recently published history of the Department of Finance from 1959 to 1999. This is an official history commissioned by the department, and Ciaran was given access to the files of the department, files which are not on general release in the National Archives and are not likely to be available to scholars in the foreseeable future. Because of these circumstances, we thought it would be of interest to invite Ciaran today to share his experiences. So, over to you, Ciaran.
Thanks, Emil. Oh, good. Slides are up. God, that's very well done. Okay, grand. There was a moment of suspense there. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Felix and Katrina, for the invitation. It's lovely to be here. So this is not from my period, but it's just a really nice photo. So we should always put style over substance, I think, which, you know. One of the things I miss most about doing this book is at social occasions when people ask what you do and you went, oh, I'm an historian. And they go, oh, great, okay. And the eyes would kind of light up for a second. You go, and what kind of history? You go, economic history. And you see them go, okay, I'm going to be struggling here. What are you working on now? And you go, a history of the Department of Finance. And there's just the fear. I probably won't get that again in my career, but it was delicious when I could do it. So I, as Felix said, I wrote a history on the Department of Finance from 1959 to 1999. I shouldn't have to sell why the department's important, but it was like easily the most powerful department and body in the state for a lot of this period. It's the second history of the department. The first was written by Ronan Fanning, published in 1978. It took a while. It took Ronan 8 years. He went off on a nice kind of junket to the US and met Henry Kissinger in the middle, which I did not get to do. I haven't met Henry Kissinger, which is tragic. It is, to the best of my knowledge, the fourth of government departments. So Mary Daly did two for her sins, agriculture and the environment. And there's one on Deeper, Murish McCarthy did. Owen Kinsler recently did one on the Defence Forces. And obviously the Academy has overseen some brilliant work on foreign affairs. But the last one on foreign affairs very clearly said this is a history of Irish foreign affairs, not the department. So I think I can claim to be the fourth. I was given 3 years-ish, so I started it and they said, oh, actually now the assistant secretary changed kind of mid-race and it turned into, okay, well now we have to publish it in 2022. So it suddenly became 2.5 years. When I applied for the job, I went onto the National Archives website and went, okay, well look, how many files has the Department of Finance published or how many files has it deposited in the National Archives? I'm like 5,000. I thought, okay, yeah, that's great. I can do 5,000. That'll be manageable. And it's only when they gave me the job and I went in and they said, oh yeah, we have another 100,000 here in the department. So that was, that was a day. So I think the department funding it was absolutely crucial. This took 3 years, 10-hour days. I was a postdoc when I got it. I could never have done it or justified the hours or the commitment to do it. It just wouldn't be feasible. Even now as a lecturer, I mean, you'd be talking maybe a 6-year commitment. I don't think people are rushing to do that. The department putting the money behind it and committing to it and owning the process and giving me the files and giving me the access and facilitating it was enormously important. And I wish that more departments would do it. There's very conspicuously, we don't have one on the Taoiseach. We'd love one on the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, one on the IDA. There's a lot to be done here. I accuse in economic history as my own kind of area that an awful lot of people who've spent their careers working on this are much more worried about, the longevity of their data sets, both in their own longevity, but also that people will ever actually be around to use the data sets when they're not there and to be able to use the file. So I think that's really, really important. Given that, it's also really important that the commissioning organisation and the researcher have compatible objectives. So the Department of Finance will come to some exceptions, but by and large, we're incredibly open to myths being punctured, asking uncomfortable questions, things like that, which was brilliant. I think they were happy enough for certain myths to be popped, TK Whitaker in particular. So I had brilliant fun with that. But if you went in, if someone was going out, say, for example, to do a kind of real kind of assassination of a department, fortunately, I kind of came out with quite a benign view, if critical. And fortunately, something that came out, the department has got an awful lot of plaudits internationally from people saying, it's brilliant that the book is actually critical, because it's much better for the department to publish something that is critical of itself rather than a whitewash. So, because there were 100,000 files, sorry, it's very unreadable from up there, but I had 3 years of filtering, essentially. So fortunately, thank God, because I don't know how I would have done it otherwise, the department have catalogued by title every single one of the files. You have the names. And from the name, you can just very, very quickly dismiss the vast, vast majority of them. I pulled, of the 100,000, 5,000. And that was taking a really generous view of what might actually be interesting of merit. So you can see there, you can't see, but whatever. If I designed the slide better, you would be able to see. From there, I've got things like, looking over, whiskey distillation in France, anything that was of potentially economic or social merit or political merit or administrative merit in Ireland or of relevance or to the department. I took OECD visits, IMF representations, ministerial speeches, anything like that. There was loads of really brilliant material. There was just a sea of appallingly useless material that you had to wade through to try and get it. There were also loads of false positives in that there were loads of files that had interesting titles and turned out to be insufferably boring. Personal context, I, in the middle of this, had a new baby and took on a very, very ill-advised renovation project, both of which are still ongoing. Sorry, Felix, you missed that. That's a bad renovation project. Both Dermot Bannon and my wife have a lot to answer for. And the renovation project, not in the baby. There's an example of one of the files. So that's actually quite an interesting one. It was the first step in Ireland pulling down its protective barriers in '63. Anyone who's kind of familiar with these things will know the drill. But again, it's really exciting pulling these files, and you can see down the side who's taking them out. No one had looked at this since 1977. It's a really important file. It was great fun. So broadly, what was in the files? So my favourite one by far, the one that had me literally cackling, laughing down in the department like a banshee in the government buildings, was the Roger Casement statue, which was, we repatriated poor Roger Casement's bones in 1965. There's eyewitness testimonies of the people who did them. You do not want to be repatriated, just leave your bones where they are. But it kicked off, they wanted to put a big statue of him up in Glasnevin, and it kicked off this big long saga that took 20 years to resolve, included Sinn Féin gun running, cottaging in Dunleary, things like that. Eventually, poor Casement ended up in Bannistrand, knocked off 3 separate protests. The locals hate the statue is facing the wrong way. It was an amazing statue, and it goes on. It takes about 3 pages. It's brilliant fun. On the other side, and again, this is, I am not being kind of flippant when I say you can dismiss an awful lot of the files. In the 1960s, so because of the Department of Finance, any extraordinary expenditure in government had to be justified by finance. So you build a bridge anywhere in the country, that becomes its own file. They also did all the HR stuff for the civil service. So anyone who was fired anywhere in the civil service becomes a file. They were forever firing postmen. like just files after files after files firing postmen. And obviously I couldn't look at that because it was no historical interest and none of you care at all why they fired postmen, but it was robbing stuff. And the last one, and then, so the flip side, so the ones that were potentially really interested or, shouldn't have been interesting about Roger Casement, there was one file which I was like going, this is a mother load, I'm going to find everything. There was a file in the 1980s called Top Secret Documents. And I was like, this is career making, this is phenomenal. It was in the 1980s, I was like, I'm going to find out where Shergar is buried, this is fantastic. And it turned out to be a process document for civil servants on what they should do with files if they were top secret, which is just like crushing. So anyway, that was, so there's something else to bore people with at parties. The departmental archive, so, is split between the 100,000 files, are between, so, Merrion Street, the whole government building's basement, the finance bit is all files. And there's a huge warehouse out in Finglas. There's an archives and file management team who were absolutely brilliant. They were fantastic. They couldn't have done enough for me. They pulled every file I wanted. They were a massive help with scanning. I couldn't have got through it otherwise. They were hugely friendly and obliging through a period when I was essentially like hermetic. During it, I spoke to the team lead and I was like, you've just been so brilliant. Like, thank you so much. This has been brilliant. And he kind of said, well, like, to be honest, it was in the middle of COVID, so we didn't have a huge amount else to do, which I think is the first instance in the Irish public service of public servants making up excuses for why they were so helpful, which is, more of that, please. There's a Wuhan Institute of Virology, just a little bit of context. So the boxes, these are the ones that I pulled and had to look at. So this is a full corridor in the basement of the archives, shoulder height, and that's the 1960s files. And the problem is they mushroom as time goes on. The quality falls and the volume rises. So this is maybe a quarter of the 1960s files, or 1990s files. And you can see my post-its all along the boxes like pride flags, which was not intentional, just that's how the post-its come. But yeah, the National Archives were going bananas at me because it was literally truckloads of files coming. And, I felt obliged to point out I was the one who actually had to read them. But there you go. So there's an awful lot of like glancing at files, working out very quickly what was in them and moving on. This is not the Department of Finance. This is a closing scene, well done, closing scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark where they dumped the Ark into the middle. But I think as an artist's impression, I think you convey something important. The National Archives, probably a little less benign. So there were about 1,000 files to go through. Anyone who's used the archives will know they have a 6-file rule per day that you're only allowed to take out 6 files. Obviously 1,000 files I couldn't have done. You just, like, it wouldn't have been feasible. So they relaxed that, which was great. On a related note, Jed, I worked out yesterday because I was trying to do it. It was like if I pulled out all 100,000 files, how long the project would have taken? That's 50 or 60 years. So I don't know if anyone has the patience for that. The archives, and I'm sure it's other people's experience, absolutely adored turfing me out early. So 4:30 they start coming around and going, we close at 5, get out. They hated me. I was actually threatened with being physically thrown out one day, which as someone who has lived an incredibly tame life and never been thrown out of a pub or a nightclub would have been deeply shaming, being physically ejected from the National Archives on many levels. There are massive capacity shortfalls. So the first day I arrived, there was a sign up saying, because of staff shortages today, we will not be handing out files, which is quite the coup for your National Archives. There was also, that happened a couple of times. There were, we're not handing out files today. There was also, and again, because the files coming from the department, the archives and back were by the truckload, a truck went out. So there were 3 files. And so in 1966-67, the Minister for Education goes on a solo run and announces the introduction of free secondary school education. Really landmark thing. There were 3 files in the department. There were meant to be 6. 3 files were lost. 3 were on the department's reaction. I was going, these are going to be great. They got shipped over to the National Archives in a truck in like hundreds of boxes. Archives went, no, we don't have space for them, and sent them back. And I went in to get them and I was told they're in that room somewhere, totally unsorted in a box. Find them if you want. So again, those are still floating around somewhere. We don't know how the Department of Finance, well, we do, they hated it, but it would have been nice to see that properly. And again, so the 60s files, a lot of the ones I picked, the ones you saw in the corridor, were in the National Archives and were sent back to finance so I could kind of get through them quicker. By the 1970s, very, 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 very few were in the National Archives. They don't have the capacity to take them, they don't have them. So we can talk about a 20-year rule or a 30-year rule. We effectively, for these files, have de facto 50-year rule. They're just not in the National Archives. And if they are, you can get 6 a day and leave at 4:30. Trade secret, this is the one I used just for the National Archive. I've been using this stuff for years. Tiny scanner. I think you have to pay for this one now, but there's alternatives which are good too. And you just scan everything into a PDF, upload it as a file. It'll go up into Google Docs by the time you're home. It's brilliant. It means you can spend all night looking at these files, going blind. Other sources. So Sean McDermott was the secretary of the department from 87 to 1994 and left very copious diaries, as in volumes of them. And he collated them all as well, which is amazing, which was brilliant. Really useful to have those. And I would urge anyone near the seat of power ever to please keep diaries. It was great to get them. They're in the National Library, which has more generous opening hours and obviously much more salubrious surroundings, so that was nice. The Irish Photo Archive. So to the best of my knowledge, none of the departments had official photographers. So certainly for finance and for a load of the other really important departments, they used a small photography company in the North Inner City called Lensman, who did them for years. Incredibly high quality photos. There's tens of thousands of them. Lensman was sold to a lady who I spoke to and whatever and went out to get the photos. They were running the archive pro bono as a charity. It's some of the most important, photos in the Irish state. And she was saying to me, during COVID, she was like, the company could go under, these could all end up in a skip. So, again, this is an incredibly important resource, and I don't think people even really are aware that it's there. I've been trying to get, the National Library or someone to take it on. If anyone can help me with that at all, that would be great, because I think they'd very happily deposit them. And it's just crazy that these are sitting there and could be lost at any moment. I'll give some examples of the Lensman photos. They're incredible quality. And again, without those, these are the ones I pulled hundreds of them for the department. Without these, we don't have pictures of what, the people running the state look like. We don't have photos of major events of the state, which is pretty poor. I did loads of interviews with senior civil servants and former ministers. I probably didn't make wonderful use of those, Felix will suggest, but I'm not an oral historian. And certainly some of the ministers, obviously, it was off the record, but really good fun. The Central Bank Archive is great. I use the UCD archive quite a lot as well. They were very accommodating. The Oireachtas has an online library, which they keep very, very quiet. The material is brilliant. The interface is terrible, but it's well worth a go. And the online archive, people like the IMF and the OECD have great archives as well. That's one of the Lensman photos. So the turnover tax was introduced in the 1960s, and all the traders rocked up to the Dole to protest. But the quality of that for the and again, they're all the same quality. They're all professional. And they're brilliant. That's another one, which is in the 1960s. So the Asgard, which is a boat they're on, was used to smuggle guns into Howth in the advance of the 1916 Rising. It disappeared for decades, and then suddenly some enterprising civil servant opened up a copy of Yachting World magazine in the 1960s, and someone in the UK was just selling it, and it was called, it was the Asgard. So they bought it and used it as a training vessel. There's Charles Haughey as Minister for Finance on the left. AI suggested a caption for this, which I just love so much. It was like, a man in uniform on a boat. And I just thought that Charles Haughey was written out of it. I nearly should have just put it up. But anyway, so to sum up, there is a man in uniform on a boat. And that's the final one is James Ryan, Minister for Finance, Lemass, and Frank Aiken coming home from, or going home, I'm not sure, but on an Aer Lingus flight, again in the 60s. So there are enormous challenges for departmental archives. One is sensitivity. They need to be screened. My kind of gut reaction with these would be leave them open. It's fine. Who cares? I can't really kind of publicly talk about why some of these do need to be screened. I can talk to, if people want to kind of discuss separately, I can tell them. But there's the very, very odd file which kind of needs a look over before they're made open to the public. And it's a tiny, tiny proportion of them, but they just need, or you have someone like me where there's an element of trust that obviously if the department had done something shocking, I totally would have gone public with that. But if there's just something that is going to harm an individual or do something and there's no historical merit, I'm not going to go and do that for no reason. You probably need either someone to screen all the files before they're made available or someone where there's a degree of trust to look at them. There's a volume of them. Again, 100,000, you're talking, so a warehouse, a team of people working on this. I don't think with a huge amount of thought about for what end. I mean, ultimately, most of these files will never, ever be looked at. And again, you can talk about the cost of, commissioning this research. I think, did I end up in one of the newspapers was like, department splurges €40,000 in its own history. It was like, no one ever thinks about the cost of splurging on keeping these files for decades and never paying for any research to be done with them. The quality is unbelievably mixed, as I said. So again, it takes someone with an eye for the historical relevance to go, are these ever going to be used? And obviously by their nature, we've heard a lot about files where they pertain to individuals and they're very important. An awful lot of these files don't pertain to any specific individuals, don't have any historical merit, and we need to think about what we do with them. They're very often patchwork and without context. So your best file, like the Roger Casement one, has like a dramatic beginning, digging up a body, middle, protests, and an end, Bannistrand. Most of them don't. They start in the middle of something. They'll be like, oh yeah, we're joining the EMS or something like that, European Monetary System. There won't be great context. There mightn't be a conclusion. I kind of always thought you have to build up a scaffolding with all the secondary literature so that the files actually kind of make any sense. There is obviously, flack is a word used in Noam Chomsky's book. It's this idea that media or powerful organizations and so on can shape the media agenda by kind of, hassling journalists and so on. I'm not saying that, that certainly didn't happen in this context, but definitely there is room for a commission or an organization to put pressure on a researcher about what they want, what they don't want. I always laugh at, the department had absolutely no objection. I could call them negative. I could say that they didn't plan enough. I could say that they were way too reactive. And they all accepted that. If I said they didn't have enough economists, people got really, really upset. They didn't have enough economists. They didn't have enough economists. So a researcher, in particular a researcher with necessarily who's in early stage, is vulnerable, can face that on one side, and I know Ciaran and I spoke about that early on, reputational damage on the other side. If it's ever found that you've hidden something, you've pulled your punches, or you've glossed over something, there's obviously a real risk of reputational damage on the other side. I think that needs to be really considered and thought about by the commissioning organisation and in general. It's a real concern. And if you've got someone who is, liable to be kind of pushed around, and if you've got the wrong personalities in charge, I think that's a real risk. Certainly, sorry, I'm just noticing I've gone over. I will stop. I will be okay. Decisions in the corridors, definitely. Certainly in the central bank archives, the archivists have said this to me. The first generation of people in the central bank kind of say everything and document everything because they don't really think about the fact that in 20, 30 years' time, people are going to get access to these files. As time goes on, people are much more circumspect about what they publish or what they file, particularly criticisms of colleagues. What's brilliant is some of the split off departments of the Department of Finance go off, they say horrible things about the Department of Finance, and then those files are brought back in. So I got them anyway, so that was good fun. There's definitely a diminishing in the quality of what's documented with printers. So in the 1960s, you'll have all these scraps between the departments and you see what everyone thinks and arguments for and against something or whatever. Once the printers come along, people just go, oh, sure, we'll chuck in the white paper. It's much easier, but it's obviously terrible history. I don't need the white paper. The white paper's of no use. I need the argument that brought about the white paper. And definitely, and something we thought about and discussed, is the move online in the 1990s and beyond. So very quaintly, by the 1990s, people are emailing each other, but they're printing off their emails and putting them in the file, which obviously, as we all know, into the 2000s and beyond, is not going to be happening. So there will be deposited in each of these departments millions of emails. They will be enormously useful. We should have down the road the technology to be able to actually pull what's relevant, and AI should be able to do that in time. It's all about, is that stuff going to be stored properly, and are all of the agreements and so on in place that historians will be able to access that in the future. If we are, there's going to be very exciting history books written of the present down the line. And if there's not, I don't know what people are going to do. So it's something we need to think about now. Thank you very much. That's it from me. Thank you.